I think it's always something where you need to have some base amount of knowledge about how JavaScript works to really be able to help these sites properly. And in addition, you also need to have the normal SEO knowledge. So that's something where sometimes the issues are with regards to how Googlebot is able to process the JavaScript. And a lot of times the issues are very basic SEO issues, like they're not using URLs on a website. So they have a single page app, it's all the same URL, but you can click around and see different content. And this is something where an SEO would look at it and say, oh, it's so obvious, you need separate URLs. Or they don't have links between the individual URLs that they have, but they link with a JavaScript functionality. So maybe like a button or an image that calls JavaScript and says, oh, load the other page. And an SEO would look at that and say, there are no links, therefore Googlebot will not be able to crawl this website. So that's something where knowing how JavaScript works and being able to understand how the rendering side works is one thing, but also being able to bring in the kind of foundational SEO knowledge that you have collected over the years is also very important. So I don't think there's like one single thing that causes the most problems. It's really a combination of various things. But one thing I do want to say there is JavaScript is not going away. So more and more developers are using JavaScript frameworks. And it's something that, as an SEO, you need to be open to the reality that JavaScript is being used everywhere. So you can't go to all of these developers and companies and say, oh, you should get rid of all of your JavaScript and make a static HTML page, because that's not the reality. That's very rare that you'll be able to tell them, like, you need to remake your whole business on the website again. Now you have to do something completely different just for SEO. So you have to be able to speak in their language and be able to communicate in a reasonable way with them, to explain the issues in a way that is logical and understandable for them as well. So instead of going to them and saying, like, you should turn off JavaScript because Googlebot will break, it's important to figure out what is the problem with their current setup and explain it in a way that they understand from a technical point of view, and not that it comes across as, oh, I am following the church of Google SEO, and you must follow these guidelines blindly without knowing what they're about. So being able to communicate with developers that are working on these JavaScript sites, I think is very critical, and very much something that any SEO who wants to be on top of their game for the long run, they really need to build up these skills.
I would say server-side rendering because it has a bunch of benefits besides SEO. So the browser starts parsing HTML as it arrives. The same with CSS. So if you have your style sheets and your content, the browser starts displaying it as soon as it can start displaying it. Unlike JavaScript. JavaScript cannot be parsed or executed in the streaming fashion. So basically, especially on mobile, data comes in, it starts coming in, and then it takes a while until the last bit goes through the line. So using server-side rendering, you have as much content as possible in the HTML already, which means that the data starts showing up in the browser quicker. That's fantastic. It also works better with crawlers and search engines that do not support JavaScript, because the content is, at least some of the content is there. If you do proper server-side rendering, then that means that your links will be just proper links, which means that if you have additional content that just doesn't load with fancy transitions in a crawler that doesn't support that, but it does mean that it gets discovered quicker even in Googlebot, because we have this link extraction at the this escape hatch in the process. Other crawlers will also be dealing with it better, so it's just like a win-win. It's faster for your users, it is better for your bots and crawlers. It gets your links discovered faster, which is sometimes really important. I wouldn't see why you wouldn't do it. There is, that being said, that means an investment in development. You need to make sure that the developers budget that in, and have the time and resources to actually make it happen, because it's not the default way.
So yeah, I would go with pagination. Again, load more buttons are okay if used if used well. And again, I wouldn't say that JavaScript here is a problem. It's more about who designed that JavaScript. I don't want to offend someone. Like whoever designed that should put a little bit more work into understanding that, for example, Google doesn't click. So you need to understand that there has to be a physical link in the code. So any solution, I don't think it's between choosing like pagination or load more. I think it's if you go with load more, there are ways to make it work with not only Google, because this is a problem for every single search engine. Actually, now we mostly have 3 big ones or 4, but every single search engine is going to struggle with that. But we can assume that Google, with JavaScript, Google is top 1. So if Google is struggling with that, Bing is going to most likely ignore that. The same about Baidu and other search engines.
I think it's a pretty good state at the moment. There's always room for improvement. One of the things that recently we announced is kind of the speed of JavaScript rendering, which is a lot faster than it used to be. Maybe it's still not completely perfect, so there's probably room to be done there. But in general, I think it's a pretty good state. Like it's much rarer that I see websites come to me and say, I have a JavaScript website and it's not working in search. I think the combination of Googlebot rendering being much better and our documentation being a ton better for these kind of sites.
Absolutely.
That makes it so that, like, if you're a developer and you kind of think about search, then you can find the information that you need on what you can do.